Hey, good afternoon again, my friends. As you're coming in, I just want to make sure that you are able to hear this okay, and let me know that you're able to hear it and see it okay, and that the signal's strong and the picture's not breaking up for you. So I'm just going to give a couple of minutes for people to start to come in and build a little bit of an audience. I'm going to let you know I'm exceedingly excited. I do have a special guest here with me, and we're going to be doing another interview around the many issues that surround the water here in Michigan, and the many threats to it and its importance. So it's my extreme honor to be able to introduce to you Frank Ettawageshik, and he is a leader of many different communities in this area. So I'm going to turn the camera across to Frank and let him tell you exactly what all his titles are. So, okay, Frank, welcome.
Right. As you said, I'm Frank Ettawageshik. I'm the Executive Director for the United Tribes of Michigan. I work with all 12 of the federally recognized tribes in the state. I'm also the former tribal chairman here at Little Traverse Bay Bands of Ottawa Indians in Harbor Springs, Michigan. I was chair there for 14 years, and now I've been 6 years in this job as a staff person representing the tribes and working with them on a variety of issues. Over the years, I've had a lot of experience working on, as a tribal chairman, I've worked on a lot of issues that in relation to water. President Bush appointed a cabinet-level task force to work on the Great Lakes. This was during his first term in office, and part of that was that the the administrator of the EPA was charged with creating a significant regional collaboration under that executive order. That regional collaboration was hosted through the Council of Great Lakes Governors in Chicago, and I ended up being chosen to represent on the conveners of that collaboration, all of the tribes from Minnesota all the way down through and into New York. I was what they call the convener, or the presider on that conveners meeting. Mayor Daley of Chicago was the representative of all the mayors. Congressman Ehlers from Grand Rapids was the head of the Great Lakes Congressional Caucus, and Governor Taft of Ohio and Governor Doyle of Wisconsin were the co-chairs of the Great Lakes Governors Conference, and they served on this, as well as a fellow from the President's Domestic Policy Council on Environment. This group convened the meeting in Chicago, where we signed a Great Lakes Declaration on working together for the collaboration, and we set out to have a work group that worked under the conveners to pull together what ended up being 1,500 volunteers from across the Great Lakes on the U.S. side. This group was to consider 7 issues that related to the Great Lakes and the quality of water in the Great Lakes. There were 9 issues that had been identified as being important that needed to be dealt with. 2 of those issues, diversion of water from the Great Lakes and bulk groundwater withdrawal, they were dealt with in a separate way on a process through they were dealt with in a Great Lakes Compact that was put together between the 8 states and the 2 Canadian provinces. That was an international agreement that would include them. And that agreement has been put in place. There's a lot of issues that came to work under those. And since the tribes were part of working on that and on that compact and the international agreement, the First Nations from the Great Lakes area from Canada also worked on that. And we were able to help that compact and that international agreement have language that was not harmful to tribes and to treaty rights and treaty issues. Rather, it at very least it acknowledged our rights and left room for us to be part of what was going on, as opposed to us having to break our way in by going to court every time. So those agreements have actually been in place, and as recently as this last year, when the city of Waukesha, Wisconsin was looking for approval of using Great Lakes water, this process under those compact was put in place, and the tribes and First Nations played a major role in the way that agreement was eventually crafted for Waukesha. But the separate part of this was this Great Lakes regional collaboration. And that collaboration dealt with all 7 of those other issues. Issues such as point source pollution and persistent bioaccumulative toxics like mercury, the areas of concern, those Superfund sites around the lakes that have been identified as major sites of pollution and harm to the lakes and to all of us that live around the lakes. We also dealt with issues of transportation, ballast water issues. We're part of that whole process. And there's a plan that was put together, and this was part of the task, those of us that were on this convening committee. We wanted to have a 50-page document, and we had 7 committees, each of which wanted to produce 200 or 300 pages of documentation on their issues. And so we managed to get them to pare it down. Eventually, at the end, we had a 75-page report on the preservation and restoration of the lakes. This is after a couple of years. And we also had a 500-page addendum that had all of the information in it that we couldn't get in the report. These are really important documents in that it's the work of scientists and lay people and activists and tribal members, tribal governments, tribal citizens, First Nations folks that were working with us. All of this made it into this report that's part of the EPA that's there. This report, we then went to try to get funding for this report because initially we identified $50 billion of need in working around the Great Lakes. And this $50 billion included such things as new water supply systems, new sewer treatment plants. We have aging infrastructure all around in all of our cities and areas. We have areas that are getting a lot of development that need sewers, that their capacity to keep on dealing with septic tanks has already been met. You pretty much have to have a sewer there now. So there's all of these different areas that we needed to deal with. And a lot of cleaning up the areas of concern. So we had identified $50 billion in need. And we were told by the White House that they wanted a revenue neutral plan. Revenue neutral, of course, means you can take money from one place and put it in another place, but you're not getting any new money. Those of us in this plan rebelled and said, sorry, we'll have to issue our own report if that's the case, because we can't do that. We did, however, come down and compromise at $15 billion in need. And once we'd identified this in the report, we then had to get the funding. And there were several of us who testified before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, at which both Senator Obama and Senator Clinton were members of that committee at the time. Rahm Emanuel, who used to be the chief of staff for President Obama and currently the mayor at Chicago, he was a congressman at the time, and he sponsored one of the bills for funding. Senator Levin from Michigan sponsored one. We testified for it, and we ended up getting funded to the tune of $475 million for what had became known as the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the GLRI. That first year was $475 million. Since then, it has been funded at a variety of levels. And we now have close to $2 billion in funding has been over the intervening decade that we've collected to help do the work. The tribes have been beneficiaries of some of that money. I'm not sure if Grand Traverse has received any of the GLRI money, but I know that many of the other tribes throughout the Great Lakes have, and Little Traverse has. I see Desmond nodding yes, that you have for Grand Traverse. And I know that this is just one of the avenues that tribal energies have gone towards to try to help bring about, through the existing political mechanisms, ways to help channel funding to help the cleanup of the lakes and the protection of the lakes. There are a lot of other things that need to be done in doing these. We had a really hard time getting into the compact process, getting into the restoration process, and this whole thing with the 7 issues that I talked about, this collaboration that ended up in the GLRI. That collaboration, we were named by the president in his executive order as what tribes were, as being part of that. So we didn't have to do anything to fight our way into that. But into the compact process and the international agreement process, we couldn't get to the table. They wouldn't let us. So I met with the head of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, and I suggested to him that that we needed to be at the table. And you know, it was a meeting where there was no commitment made of any sort, and we had tried to get there. And I said to him, sort of off the cuff, I said, well, you know, if we're not going to let us at the table, we're going to have to call our own meeting, and we'll all get our own policy, and then you'll have to negotiate with all of us one-on-one. And by the way, I said, there's over 180 of us in the Great Lakes Basin. And, well, we didn't get to the table. So I sort of felt my bluff had been called. So I was going to a meeting down in Fort Lauderdale of the National Congress of American Indians. There were representatives of the Assembly of First Nations that were there. And I met with them there, and we put together a package that created a meeting that would invite all of the tribes and First Nations that are within the Great Lakes Basin to a meeting. And the states were on the edge of signing this compact agreement with each other. Unbeknownst to us, there was a lot of issues yet, and it wasn't going to get signed. But they had a deadline, and it was deadline ready to be signed within about 8 weeks. So we called our meeting, and we raised $14,000 in cash and in kind in about 5 days, and pulled together a meeting that was held at Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, up at the Dreammakers Theater there at the tribe. And we invited all of the tribes and First Nations in the Great Lakes Basin to come to this meeting. We also drafted the Tribal and First Nations Great Lakes Water Accord, which we then sent with a letter apologizing for having the audacity to draft this without anybody else's input, and telling everybody, however, that they needed to come to this meeting and they needed to come prepared to sign the document because it was a crisis. And we needed to get this done. And we sent it out. We said, if you have edits, send them in, and let us know. And then the meeting, we sent this out with a letter to invite everybody, and we asked them to let us know that they were coming. This is back in 2004. Well, it was Friday. We were going to have the meetings on Monday and Tuesday, coming in on Sunday night. Pardon me, I'm going to turn that off. We only had about, I think, 8 or 10 people registered on Friday, and I had to order the food. So I ordered food for 120 people, just guessing. And so we went to the meeting, and we got there, and we had I think 160 people showed up.
Wow.
And we had 44 tribal chairmen, chiefs, or ogema, who showed up, one of whom was representing 55 First Nations, one was representing 42 First Nations, and others were all representing individual tribes. There was some overlap with some of those that are represented by consortia. And there were very few edits to the document. And of those people who showed up, 42 showed up with the authority to sign. And we read the document. All the leaders spoke, and after all the leaders spoke, and we were ready to sign this document, we had women hand drum singers singing water songs while we were being done. It was printed on acid-free paper. It's so that it would last forever. We signed a number of original copies of it. And we had a list of all of the leaders to sign, but then we had a separate list for everybody in the room to sign as a witness. Whoever was there, cameraman, everybody was a witness. And to sign, and we had a drum that sang a song, and everybody danced afterwards. And we did this whole big operation. And basically, the water accord says we've been here since time immemorial. It's our sacred duty to protect the waters. And it's nice to know that the other governments are finally waking up to the fact that they need to be doing this to the extent they are. We want to work with them, but if they don't work with us, they leave a huge hole in the protection of the lakes. We're an essential part of that because we have court adjudicated rights, property rights, and treaty reserved rights to exercise, and all of that's there. And if that's not in this agreement, then the agreement, there's all kinds of holes in it. You need to have us to be part of it, and we pledge to work on it. But, you know, we need you to work with us. Within 24 hours, we were invited to the table after 2 years of trying to get there and not being able to get there. And at that point, we started what became a year-long process of negotiations. Those negotiations, there was a tribal caucus that was created. They really learned how to consult with tribes, that they need to contact the elected leaders and be government to government. They also need to have things that contact the tribal public as well as the general public. But they had to do a government to government contact. And so they got trained very well, and actually we've worked pretty well together over the years since then. But this all happened, and that we were able to get the offending language, as I said, out of that compact and out of that international agreement, to the point where we were able to speak at the signing, and it was up in Milwaukee. We were able to speak for the signing. I spoke for the tribes here, and the chairman, Vernon Root, from Saugeen First Nation, who was the chair at the time. He's a council member today, I believe. But he spoke on behalf of the First Nations, and all the governors and the premier's representatives all signed the document. And then we had to work on implementing it and getting it passed. The interstate compact had to not only be signed there, but then it had to be taken to the 8 Great Lakes state legislatures and adopted verbatim in each one of them. They couldn't change a word, which is a real trick to get that done. And Michigan was smart when they passed theirs, because under this you're protecting groundwater, particularly dealing with bulk groundwater withdrawals. You had to have legislation that would implement that. Michigan passed its implementation legislation as part of the approval of the compact. Ohio passed its approval separately and then tried to pass legislation later, and it was tougher. But the fight in Michigan was on the original approval. And so today what this has done is gives us the tools, for instance. There's a whole other path for the tools on this, but this is one of the places where it gives us the tools to deal with the issues surrounding, like, the Nestle water withdrawal that's going on, because that's pursuant to the implementation of this compact, because it's a bulk groundwater withdrawal. This whole thing came out of those negotiations for that interstate compact and its subsequent debate on the implementing legislation. So we have done a lot of work on how to do that, and that's one of the set of tools that we have in dealing with, like with Nestle, and likewise dealing with the issues, say, with Line 5. But when we did all of this work, we were looking at all of the potential issues in the future that might come up. Line 5 had not, it existed, it was there, but it wasn't on people's radar as being an issue yet when we did all of these initial agreements. And these agreements created twice-a-year meetings there's I guess there's one other track I need to follow first, and this starts back in 2002, when the tribes in the state, all the tribes and the state of Michigan, agreed to a tribal state compact. Governor Engler signed that, and the tribal chairman all signed it, and it basically acknowledged the sovereignty of the tribes. It established that the governor's office would have a liaison to Indian country, and that all the different agencies and departments would have a liaison. It has set up a monthly tribal state forum phone call for us to work with. And it set up this process by which we, subsequent to that, adopted a tribal state water accord. We adopted an economic development accord, a climate change accord, and an addendum to the economic accord. All of those things put various pieces in place that we're using. The water accord establishes meetings twice a year held between the state government and the tribal governments. This is not the Michigan Tribal Environmental meetings. This is a separate meeting, and so that meeting is usually held in concert with the meeting on the climate accord. Those are two that should be held together twice a year, and those meetings are where we agree to work with the state and sort of share what we're doing with each other and try to find ways we can work together, or find ways that we can get out of each other's way if there's something that each one of us is doing and the other isn't. Those are things that we put in place. Well, because of those accord, in that original 2002 accord, it also talks about a consultation policy that both if the state's going to do something that affects the tribes, that they will consult with us. But it's a two-edged sword, because if we do something that's going to affect the state, we also are under an obligation to consult with the state on those things. So it's a two-way street. We have done that. There have been numerous incidents where we have taken actions at the tribal level that we let the state know about, both environmentally and also in regulatory issues and law. So it's gone both ways. But because of that consultation policy, and because of the accord and the international agreement, and because of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative issues, we now have the ability, through that and various state laws, to consult with the state. So, for instance, there's been a request for consultation on the Nestle water issue, and we have had consultations with the state. And this is government to government level, which often, really quickly, you have the leaders talk to each other briefly, but they all bring their staff, because the staff or the experts are the ones that know what they're talking about. And if the leaders speak, it's usually from a prepared statement that the staff is prepared. Sometimes some of the leaders are up to speed on the issues on all of these, but mostly it's to try to talk together, to establish that it's a government-to-government relationship. So we have all of this framework, and so when you're talking about Line 5 and the issues there, you're talking about the issues of water withdrawal. You talk about all the issues in Flint and the things that have gone on there. All of these different issues together, there's this framework of agreements that we've worked out, intertribal agreements with each other and also with the state, that have created a mechanism for us to work together on these issues. It doesn't mean we're always going to agree, but it means that we have the mechanism in place before we have the problem to deal with it once the problem comes up. And so those are, it's within that context that anything else here that we may talk about, I think, was there. And I wanted to give that background to folks, because I don't know how many people are aware of all of these different things and how they all fit together.
Well, I certainly appreciate that, because I certainly wasn't aware of the majority of that, and you speak very eloquently and in a way that people can understand. So how are these agreements being used, though? I mean, there's this great framework in place, but for example, how are they being used to be able to shut down Line 5?
Well, you got to realize the agreement isn't that we can shut down Line 5. The agreement is that we're going to consult with each other about it and try to reach a conclusion. If we want it shut down, well, we can make our best argument to get it shut down. The agreement isn't that they'll shut it down. Okay, so now they may, very well, we might be persuasive. I heard Desmond here be very persuasive with his testimony when we were having a hearing on Waukesha. And several of the points that he made in his testimony made it into the final agreement. And that's how we have effects. We have those effects. You were talking about microbeads. You were talking about the variance in the level of water in the river, and you were talking about all of those different things, and those things made it into the considerations in that final agreement. You know, Waukesha had to agree to deal with microbeads. They had to agree to deal with pharmaceutical pollution, have a program for collecting pharmaceuticals as part of this whole thing.
That's great. It makes me want to ask questions now. So how can we, as representative of Grand Traverse Band, and given my council's action to their resolution calling for the immediate shutdown of Line 5, how can we trigger that consultation?
Well, the consultation has already been engaged on this. We all got letters about the consultation on this. You know, we've already met on this issue. And not that we can't continue it, it's the beginning of discussions. Likewise, we've met on Nestle. Okay, and so when I think that the issue is that, you know, I always say that tribal governments are lobbyable governments. Whenever somebody wants us to do something and we're not doing it, they want to sue us. And when they sue us, they don't just sue us to get us to do it, they question our very existence. And it costs us all millions of dollars. Like they didn't want us to fish with gill nets in the lakes. We had to spend millions of dollars on court cases to prove that our fishing rights existed. We now have, you know, the consent decree that's ongoing. It's a continuing jurisdiction of the court in this consent decree that it expires every 15, 20 years, you know, as depending on the way it goes. So we have to do all that to prove something. And what I think that we have here is that what we've got is a framework in which we can discuss things, and we have the ability to truly affect the way they think. So that means we've got to get information to them that tells them things. Like, for instance, the Dr. Ed Tim's report that he turned in, the 75-page report. I haven't read it, but I've seen his presentations. I've talked with him. I would like to know more about it, but he gave some very interesting information at the hearing the other day that about the amount of the current and the way the current is putting stress on the pipe, and some of the current is at least twice the strength that the engineers accounted for when they were putting the pipe in under the straits. They also did not figure that it would have unsupported lengths because they laid it on a bed of gravel and they thought it was going to stay there, and they didn't realize it would scour out from underneath. They didn't account on the quagga mussels that are accumulating on the surface of the pipe and the weight that would have, plus the potential toxicity of how, when they attach, what that could do, the corrosion that could cause to the pipe. There's a number of things that weren't accounted for in this process, and I think that we need to bring those things to the forefront. And the other one that we have is they need to understand, and from a tribal point of view, the strongest point we can make, if we try to go in and do this all with facts and figures and numbers and everything from us, they've got way more scientists and fact makers and report writers and everything that we not only can have, but that we could ever afford to have. And they can bury us in mountains. Like if you saw this Waukesha, the Waukesha application, did you print it?
No.
2,000 pages. Okay, I had the folks from the Union of Ontario Indians office started to print it. They got to 1,000 pages. They're only halfway done, and they said, "Gee, look at this," you know. Well, and what we had 45 days to respond to this 2,000-page application. There's just no way that we have the ability to do that. But we have something else. We have our traditions and our culture and our heritage. We have the talking about the spiritual quality of the water. We have this, and while we also have the facts and the figures and the scientists and the engineers, we can counter those arguments. what we have is the spiritual quality of the water, and the fact that water is life, water is essential to life. And you can live without oil, but you cannot live without water. So we have all of these different things that we can help bring that message out. And society as a whole has a tendency to, they listen to us when we speak this way. When Linda Wood sang the water song at that hearing, it was a powerful moment. You know, that was a great thing. I heard a gentleman from Mackinac sing a song at one of the previous meetings. He's not Indian, but he sang a song about the day the pipeline broke. It was pretty powerful, but he was singing. Okay, he was singing his testimony. Oh, that's something that doesn't happen a lot.
Right.
The thing is that we have ways of helping communicate. So there's things that we can do there. The other things, so we can do that. The other things that we can do are, we have, because of the treaties, we can raise the issue of treaty rights and how this affects the implementation of those treaty rights. And we have the ability to do that in legal actions in court if we need to. And we can assert those short of court into these arguments and ask them to justify to us how we're wrong about this. And so if they want to counter our arguments, it can be burdens on them to explain to them how what they're doing won't impact us, rather than us having to prove how it will. I believe that we can do that. So there's a number of things that we can do like that I think that will be helpful. The other one simply is just being there. Now, I was at a prayer vigil that started at midnight on New Year's Eve and went through midnight of New Year's Day at the Straits, right at the foot of the bridge. I wasn't there the whole time. I was there for part of the time, but I did a pipe at midnight, and then I came back and did a pipe at sundown the next day, and was there for the closing. And there were other pipe carriers there for other times, and but we had people there the whole time, and community members were saying, "What are you guys doing down here?" You know, so I went up to Audie's to warm up. You know, sitting up there drinking some hot tea and warming up, and I talked to a bunch of the locals, and they were all really in favor of what we were doing, because they know how important that clean water is to everything, to all of their jobs, to everything that's going on up there. And so, I think that there's things that we can do like that. So, just letting other people know that there's people who think this way. But I think the other part of this, to me, there's a place for every single person to do something. Some people are going to stand up and write signs and protest and picket. Some people are going to do demonstrations of different sorts. Other people are going to write briefs and articles and op-eds. Other people are going to analyze mountains of documents and come up with arguments and testimony and consultations and to help write articles. It takes everybody working together to win something like this. And in the end, it makes no sense to have so much of the world's fresh water at risk from a pipeline that shouldn't be there. Now, that pipeline under the water is a real problem, and it's got to go. I mean, you see the sign in my front yard, shut down line 5. But you got to think about other aspects of this. That line starts, this line 5 that we're talking about, this particular portion, starts at Superior, Wisconsin, goes across Wisconsin, Michigan's Upper Peninsula, crosses the Straits of Mackinac, goes kitty corner down across the state down to Port Huron, and crosses over into Sarnia and there's some of it goes other places, but the bulk of it is headed for Sarnia, for the chemical, the plants there that are going to refine it and or use the petrochemicals and the chemical plants. I guess the first thing we'd mention is that the Amjanang First Nation that is surrounded by those plants right there is the first population, human population in the world to have a gender imbalance because of environmental pollution.
Can you just repeat that? The name of the nation?
Amjanang First Nation in Ontario at Sarnia is the first human population in the world to have a gender imbalance due to environmental pollution. I leave a pause because that's important. They also have an incredible number of exotic cancers and things that are very rare that are occurring at alarmingly high percentage rates and within their community. There's a documentary they put together with someone from the University of Michigan on this, and this is documented, and I know just this much about this. I don't know enough to really be a spokesman for it, but I can tell you that where does Line 5 go? It goes there. What's there? A native population that has incredible environmental problems because of those plants. So, now, there's plenty of other oil getting there. If you shut down Line 5, it isn't going to stop that problem because there's, Line 6 goes there, and so does, a bunch of others. But in all of that pipeline that I just described, and I'm not an expert on its route, but I do know a number of different places, the line that goes under the straits is heavier duty than the line that's on land. And the line that's on land has sprung leaks on more than one occasion and more than one place. And the company that runs it was the company that ran the leak that was down there on the Kalamazoo River. That was one of the largest inland spills ever. And their safety record is not real high. But the thing that concerns me is that this line, which is above ground or in the ground along this whole way, once it's on the ground, not under the water out there, it crosses every major river that flows into Lake Michigan from the Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and several from Wisconsin. At every one of those crossings is a potential spill point that could flow into the lakes. Some of them flow into like Big Bay and Little Bay de Noc, which are major rookeries for fish and other things in the region, and are closed water systems that would be, they're bays that would be much more difficult to clean up than the open lake. But there still would be, it would be contained. But the problem is that the environmental catastrophe that would happen if there were a spill there is very high. I have friends from Alaska who are walking along their traditional fishing grounds to this very day and still turning over rocks and finding oil from the Exxon Valdez. This is happening just last summer. I mean, this is still ongoing. And that's, how many years ago is that now? That's a long time ago. Okay? What happens if something like that were to happen in any one of these water crossings? So not only is Line 5 under the lake an issue, under Lake the Straits an issue, but likewise it's also an issue for all of those rivers, the Whitefish River and all the others, all across the UP. And it's also there at Indian River near 75 in the Lower Peninsula. It crosses there, and that's the waterway that goes over into Mullet Lake down to Sheboygan. And then there's other waterways all the way down, including the St. Clair River that it goes over down at Port Huron. So any one of these places is a place where there could be problems, either man-made or natural-made disasters, a lightning strike, a vehicle accident of some sort, a plane crash,
So
a meteor,
The St. Clair River, that's the connection between two Great Lakes.
Well, that's from Lake Huron down to Lake St. Clair. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we've just talked about recently the spill taking place in the Straits, and affecting Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. But so Uncle brings up a really good point, you know, and the fact that it's bigger than that. And I just wanted to stop there for a minute and think about that, and maybe just stay there for a minute, because it's this entire system, this entire line from Superior all the way to Sarnia.
Yeah, the real issue here. Someone asked me. We were talking about the Dakota Access Pipeline, talking about that, and somebody said, well, "How can we stop the pipeline?" And my answer, which seemed glib at the time, was stop driving your car. If we all stopped driving our cars, it would be less demand for gasoline, and since there's less demand for gasoline, then it wouldn't be as profitable to put in, and you couldn't put in billions of dollars into this kind of infrastructure because it would be less profit in it. And so what would happen is they'd find something else to do. But as long as we're addicted, because not only are we addicted to the use of oil, for instance, but the oil companies themselves are addicted to it, because they can't just say, "Gosh, you guys, you're right. We should just stop this," and just stop. Because they're running corporations, there are laws about what they can do, and if they endanger the assets of the company, they can be sued or fired or voted out of office or whatever, and somebody else will be put in. And so we have to find ways to help the system move away from the need for the fossil fuels. And that's the real way for us to do this. And so, yeah, we can stop a pipeline. We can close down one. But you've seen that was that Aflac commercial of the duck sitting in the boat, and there's a leak. Puts one wing over that, puts another wing over it, a foot here and a foot here, and then there's another leak. Sticks his beak in it. You know, the thing is, it sort of feel like that pipelines are that way. We could stop one, but what about the next one?
It's a big machine.
It's the system that we've got to try to figure out how to evolve beyond. One of the interesting evolutions that was hinted at that hearing was the idea that Enbridge itself has invested in wind and solar, which I found an interesting point.
Yeah, I've heard that too, and I've heard this argument about vehicles and totally agree with it. But there's always got to be a route from point A to point B.
Right.
So one thing that I've thrown around, and many people have thrown around, is this oil that is here that's coming through Michigan. How's this benefiting Michigan? Or is this, what would happen if we were to say, let's stop exporting the oil to start with, so the oil here lasts longer and we have a longer period to start putting in green energy to replace it, and you wouldn't need the new pipelines, and you could wind back.
Well, now you're talking about world trade. When you start talking about world trade, you're into some really complicated things, because we've tried we've signed on to the World Trade Organization. We have NAFTA, we have CAFTA. They want to do this Trans-Pacific thing, which Trump says he doesn't want to do, and and the point is that these kind of agreements are beneficial in some ways and detrimental in others. And trying to understand the mechanics of it, I know enough to be dangerous, but not enough to really be able to have a strong opinion on them one way or the other than I know that they do cause some issues, like, for instance, about water. When you say you stopped at a gas station on the way down here and bought a bottle of water. Did you buy the water? You did not buy the water. You bought a piece of pipe with a cap at both ends, and you paid for the service of having that water delivered to you in that container. You didn't buy the water. Water's not for sale. Water belongs to everybody. But we can't live without it, so we have to have it delivered to us. So if you're in a city and you turn your water on, and then you turn it off, you get that water and you cook with it. Did you buy the water? You get a bill for the water, but the bill isn't for the water. The bill is for the service of having the water delivered to you. That's what the bill's for. the man who taught me this, ran the Ann Arbor Water Company, who works for the municipal Ann Arbor Water Works for something like 40 years. He's the guy who first told me this 15, 20 years ago. You're not buying the water, because if you start to think of water as a commodity, you start to think of you can buy and sell water. As soon as it's a commodity, then it's subject to NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. It's subject to the Interstate Commerce Clause in the U.S. Constitution. It's subject to the World Trade Organization agreements. And as soon as you do that, you lose control over your water. Because we can't stop Arizona from getting our water if it's a commodity. If we think of it as a commodity, we allow it to be considered a commodity, then it's subject to interstate trade, and you can't say, well, you can't have this, but you can. Okay, it doesn't work that way. So when we did this, we had to protect the water as a resource, not as a property. And so that's the way we have to be thinking about it. So as soon as we start doing this, as soon as you start thinking about that water as a commodity, then you're in trouble. And so the issue with this, when you start thinking about, you start to take this into other arenas, you know, people say, why do the people have to pay for oil when they pump it out of the ground, but they don't have to pay for their water? Well, it's because you can live without oil, but you can't live without water. In other words, water is something that is not commodified. Now, we have to treat it, we have to pump it or bottle it and take it places, and we utilize it. But you know, an example of something like this that I saw is a National Geographic article, maybe 2000 or 2002, somewhere in there. And there's this picture of a street vendor in Mexico City. You know what they're selling? Air. They're selling air. Why? Because you couldn't breathe the air in the city. The smog was too bad. So you had to buy air. So that was actually a business that would support the vendors selling air. You know, what happens when we start treating air as a commodity? What if we start thinking of air as a commodity? You know, we just know we all breathe it. It's just there, so we don't think of it that way. Well, we got to think of water in that same way. That it's a human right to have air to breathe and to have water to drink and live with. And we have to think of that as a human rights issue. It's not a human right to have oil. You know, oil is something that's a commodity. We can live with it. We lived without it for most of human history, except in extremely sparing amounts. And, you know, we did use oils of different sorts. We used sturgeon oil, which is a really good sort of smokeless oil that you can burn in small quantities to warm your lodge. I don't know if you've heard about those burners that they make to do that. We've done that. We used to do that. They burned whale oil for different things, and you know, so we've used different types of oils. But petroleum is something that we've just, you know, really pretty recently in human history started using, and we're going to have to move beyond it because we're going to run out of it, which doesn't even get us into any climate change issues or you know, the issues of fossil fuel burning and all of that, that's a whole other arena to this. That it is really important, but you know, I think that we have to really have to be working on trying to figure out how to protect our water, how to protect our air, and how to protect life, because that's what we're doing when we protect those things. And it's not just our lives, but the intertwined lives of all the other beings that we share this world with. You know, there was a young man who testified. He said his Indian name, and he just made a very brief statement at that hearing that I found just wonderful. And he said that his name meant that he swims a lot, and that the water and the fish are his friends. And that was it. You know, you don't mess with your friends, you know.
I love that.
I mean, it was pretty good, you know.
It was from the
Yeah.
mouths of babes, as we'd say.
Yeah.
So if I take you back to the water, because I'm really curious about something, because we spoke about Nestle, we
Yeah.
spoke about the fact that they pay $200 to be able to take water from the Great Lake, and you spoke about not looking at it as a commodity. But if I'm taking something from one source and I'm being able to transport it all the way across the US, so that it's no longer returning to that same place, then that's becoming a problem, because if I'm allowed to continue to do that over a long period of time, I'm going to remove all the water from one place. So how do we combat that?
Well, in the states, I told you that the 8 states on the Great Lakes and the 2 Canadian provinces all negotiated with each other, first with each other and then with the tribes, tribes and First Nations at the table, and arrived at an interstate compact that was adopted by the 8 states and then sent to the U.S. Congress, where it was also adopted, and it became law. And the international agreement was signed by Ontario and Quebec, and is also an international, recognized as international law. So with that, it made it illegal to divert water from the Great Lakes. Now, that's where the Waukesha, the whole permit for the use of water by the city of Waukesha that sits just outside the Great Lakes aquifer. They're in a straddling county between the Mississippi and the Great Lakes. The county's here, the city of Waukesha is just over the line, but because they're in a straddling county, they were written into the agreement that they could use the water. But they had to jump through all these hoops in order to do it. But other places can't just they can't just tap into the lake to use the water. Waukesha itself, even though it's outside the aquifer, they could only agree to use it if their outflow of their sewage, of their treatment plants, went back into Lake Michigan. And as a consequence of that permit at Waukesha, there was 1.4 million gallons a day that was being drawn out of a well that actually was in the Lake Michigan aquifer, that was being pumped down the Mississippi after they got done using it. That's been recaptured now, and it goes back into Lake Michigan. So that was part of that whole thing at Waukesha. Now, when it comes to bottling water and being sent other places, that they call that a consumptive use, and there's one of the issues with the compact is the fact that it's right around, I think it's the size of those water bottles that go on water coolers. Okay, containers that size and smaller are considered a consumptive use and are not considered a diversion. So if you were to bottle water and put it in those containers and ship it on a railroad car around the country, then that would be a consumptive use. It's not a diversion of water. It probably should have been a smaller size container than that, but that's what it ended up being. But still, that's a really expensive way for a company to ship water out of here. It's not going to be likely that a lot of water is going to leave. But at the same time that water is leaving, the water from Bali is coming in. The apples and fruits from other places that also contain water are coming in from other places. So the question is, are we shipping more water out than we're bringing in relative to products? We decided agriculture was probably a wash because we ship a lot of fruit out, but we import a lot of fruit, and there's a lot of water in that fruit. So how are we doing on a trade-off on that? When it comes to, let's take latex paint. If you got a paint factory and you're shipping a bunch of paint, you're shipping paint all over, and you're using water in it. That water is leaving. Well, how much is coming back in from other places? In other words, there's ways to think about that. So the water that's being put in a container and shipped is a smaller proportion of things. So this thing about Nestle down here, the amount of water that they're pumping out and selling and putting out under the Ice Mountain brand, that water, more than likely, we're drinking that much Nestle water in the state of Michigan right now. Even if those particular ones leave, there may be others that are coming back in, you know, because the issue about this Nestle well isn't the one well. It's that if they set the precedent they can do this, and then we have 1,000 wells, then that's going to cause a problem. And the other thing about it is that because of the bulk groundwater withdrawal controls that had to be put in under the Interstate Compact, and that Michigan passed in its legislation, it created what's called the Water Withdrawal Assessment Tool. And that is the Department of Environmental Quality works through that. That Water Withdrawal Assessment Tool is, there's been a lot of work on aquifers, on where they are and how much water you can draw. And the safety factor they built into it was they only use about 50% of the water that they figured was available. And when you go in to put in a well somewhere, and it's going to draw, it's a large capacity well, that's going to give you can say you're going to do this and you're going to do it in this particular spot. There's a computer online system of looking at this, and the theory behind this is that all the work's been done that needs to be done, or that is the best we have, at least at the time, that'll tell us that if you pump this much water out of that well, you're not going to affect the quality of the groundwater, the streams, okay? But if you start pumping more water than what the capacity, if 3 wells go in, it'll start to say that water's used up in this area. You have to arrive at other ways of using the water, because if you draw a lot of water out of the headwaters of trout streams, the springs produce less water, the streams start flowing a little slower, and they warm up, and then the trout can't live in them anymore. So you change the values of the streams and things. So the Water Withdrawal Assessment Tool is a very complex system that has been put together to do the best we can to try to give the same tool for everybody, instead of each one being an individual judgment call on whether we can put in additional wells. Now, there's an interesting thing about that Water Withdrawal Assessment Tool, is that in the west of the Mississippi in the U.S., they have what's called prior appropriation. So if you're the first one into an aquifer, then that's yours. And somebody else drills into it, well, they can't use it. So for instance, the city of Denver might have the rights to an aquifer, and it might be right under your house. You've got to drill through that into the next one down before you can get water, even though the water's right under you, because somebody else has the appropriation on that water. The Colorado River is subject to prior appropriation for the flow of the river, to where there are more people have claims on the river than there is water in the river. And so the Colorado River, many years, by the time it gets to the ocean, is dry. Even though it used to flow with a rush all the way down. Now it's all being dammed up and taken out and used for cities and used for irrigation, and as big a mighty river as the Colorado, it often is dry before it gets to the ocean. And now that's west of the Mississippi. East of the Mississippi, Riparian Rights is the doctrine that we use, the way we think of water. And Riparian Rights means, in essence, and I'm not a lawyer, I've hung around them so often, I've been accused of being one sometimes, but Riparian Rights are that you have a right to the reasonable use of water that you live next to or that's under your property. And so everybody has that right, has that reasonable right of use. So if you drill into an aquifer that's under you, you have a right to reasonable use, even if somebody else has a reasonable use, is also using that same aquifer. So the theory behind this water withdrawal assessment tool is that as more people drill into the aquifers, and if you're the first one in and you're drawing a lot of water, and a bunch of other people drill in, you can't keep drawing the same amount of water you started drawing, because if you draw that much and then they draw the water that they have a right to, you'll overuse that aquifer. So you all have to balance your use.
It sounds like a concept I learnt when I was about 3 that you have to share with everyone.
Yeah, except for you're talking about a Coca-Cola bottling plant having to bottle less Coca-Cola because another plant goes in across the street that's got a riparian rights to use water from a similar aquifer. So now you've got competing economic interests having to negotiate with each other. We have never reached that negotiation point yet, but that's in the future of Michigan's water withdrawal assessment tool. That's somewhere down the future what we have to do, and it's built into the law that there are user groups that will meet to determine how to reach this issue once you've maxed out the use for the water that's in a particular place. And in addition to all this, I have friends that are dowsers, and you all probably know about this, that you can have a well drilling company come in and they can drill here and they can drill there and they can drill over there, and every well's bad. You'll call up a dowser, and the dowser will come in and they'll pick a spot, and the driller will say, "Yeah, I bet you that'll work because that's right next to where we just drilled, and they'll drill and there'll be good water there." The dowser can figure out where that is. That's because all of our underwater things are not all connected with each other. But the water withdrawal assessment tool makes some assumptions that the groundwater is all pretty well connected, and that that we realize that there are issues here, that there may be what they call orphan aquifers and other things. And so what we've got to do is we have a lot of work to think about how we deal with this, but this is part of that. When you're talking about why all the issues are dealing with this Nestle site, it's because it's the first one we've dealt with under this law, and they want to be sure they do it right. And so they're doing a lot of work on it, and are really asking lots of questions, trying to make sure that we get this is done as right as possible. And I guess the thing that I see about this is that I used to be on a zoning board for a township, and we had our zoning law was what most people want. They want the zoning law to zone their neighbor, but not them. Okay, they just assume that they'd be able to do anything they want, but they didn't want to be careful what their neighbors do. And the other one is that they wanted it to be as least restrictive as possible in order to protect things. But you get these, and so that means that it's permissive. Well, if you take the law that you look at it, the average zoning law for a township or a city, and then you build everything that it will allow to be built, you do a build-out study to build it to its maximum, you'll discover that the zoning laws are way too permissive in most cases for what is actually the carrying capacity of the land. You can't build that many things. And so what we have to do is we have to start thinking as a society that we may need more restrictive laws about lot size and about what you can do with things to not allow as many buildings to build. Well, when you start thinking about maxing out how many wells you can put in, what happens when we start thinking about that, not just in building permits, but we start thinking of that in terms of wells? How many wells can you put in? You know, what's going to be the maximum? What's going to happen when we hit that wall? Okay, what are we going to be thinking about in terms of our uses? So we have all of those things to think about, and as tribal people and for our indigenous people here, you know, we have to deal with the needs that we have as a community, as a tribal nation, on both what we need for our societies to operate, both from a commercial point of view, from our tourism industry point of view, from our farming and our household industry, you know, just our life. What do we need in order to survive, and how do we protect our rights to that? And also, how do we protect water in general? Because we can't protect our water without protecting everybody's water. We can't protect our air without protecting everybody's air. And so what we do and what I've tried to take a message to people is that what we're doing is things that will help human beings survive. Because when we work on our survival, we're helping others to survive as well.
Absolutely. And one thing you mentioned, I mean, you mentioned earlier Flint. And one thing that puzzles me, just from a common sense standpoint, is you have a company bottling water from very close by to a disaster that's happened, and they're making a profit from that water by selling that water that's coming from the state to the state to help solve the problem in Flint. So, I mean, can you speak a little bit on Flint? I only have a very small amount of knowledge, so if I misspeak, I apologize.
Well, you know, Flint was there's just a whole lot of issues that came with Flint. I mean, Flint was a problem that was building for years because of the strength of the auto industry, and then as the auto industry failed, the city itself had a lot of infrastructure, had municipal things that they could no longer afford to operate. There were schools that they could use the classrooms, but they couldn't use the labs and the auditoriums and stuff. They didn't have the money to operate the rest of the things. So you had all of this stuff. Plus, you also had the situation where they had deteriorating infrastructure and less money to pay for it. And so you run into all this. Then they run into the whole question about how there was a city, the state sent in managers to manage the place, who managed it from a business point of view. And I always think that government and business are not the same thing. And that many business leaders who think that they can apply business philosophy to government end up coming up short in trying to do so, because it doesn't translate. It doesn't mean that you can't be efficient in government, and you can't expect accountability, and you can't expect well-run governments, because a well-run government is not necessarily a business. But the government itself serves the public, and they're owned by the public. The business serves the business and the board of directors of the business, and it's not owned by the public. So business answers to itself and to its particular owners or stockholders. Government answers to all the people. And so there's a different way of thinking about those two things. When you take a business practice and try to apply it into a government, you run into things where a business may make decisions. So we have a business leader who's making decisions in Flint, trying to do it from a business point of view, saying, you guys have been messing up for years running this as a government, we're going to run it as a business. And then they make some decisions that turned very bad for them. They made some bad decisions. So what happens to them? The business leaders who come in, who make the bad decisions, they pack up and go home. The people in Flint now have to live with what happened. And so the part of that, some people will say, well, it's their own fault because they didn't demand a government that would treat them fairly and do what was supposed to be done. So you got all of those kind of issues going on at Flint. And so there's these underlying issues at Flint. But then you get to the point where you have water. Now, what people haven't talked about is when they changed water systems, the water coming in had a different level of corrosiveness than the water that they were using. And they didn't treat the water when it came in, and for whatever reason. And that untreated water stripped the patina off the inside of the lead pipes that had accumulated over years of use. And suddenly the bare lead was then able to leach into the water. What happens when the pipes were new and they put them in? They were bare lead, and they were used for years before they developed the patina that protected. And so they poisoned the people for a long time, and nobody said anything about it because nobody knew about it. But we had lead poisoning years ago when they put those brand new lead pipes in. Okay? And then that patina developed to protect everybody. And they didn't replace those old lead pipes because they've been replacing them as they go, but the city's got so many they hadn't replaced them. And then they have this new water system going through there, and all of a sudden they have this. The new water system was a stopgap measure before they started using other water. Now what they were doing is privatizing the water system in Flint. So their new water system, as I understand it, was going to come from Lake Huron, and it was a private enterprise. It was a private entity that would then be providing the water to Flint, as opposed to the city of Detroit, which was providing the water before that. They were getting the water from the city. And so this was done because it would save money. Well, clearly that failed because it's now cost them 100 times, if not 1,000 times more than they ever would have saved in the monies that they have to pay to clean this up and to deal with the health issues. And so what happened in Flint, to me, it's not the issue of Nestle selling water to Flint, about selling bottled water to Flint to replace this. The issue has to do with why the system happened in the first place, and then what can we do to help the people there have safe drinking water, and how do you provide that water? I've been in a lot of places in the world where you can't drink the water from the tap. Even the locals don't drink it. They get a bottle of water, and they never drink out of a bottle of water that they haven't opened themselves. They uncap it themselves so they know it's fresh. And when they drink, they don't even touch it to their lips. They pour it into their mouth. Because they know that if they touch it, it may be set in ice that was not protected water. And you don't drink iced drinks unless you froze the ice yourself from purified water, because the ice is usually tap water, and it's going to have the things in it that aren't good for you. I was in India for over a week, and this is where I saw this going on, okay, in this way. I've been other places where I was in Moscow. You can't brush your teeth with the water. They had bottled water in the bathroom for us to brush our teeth. Because they had wood, wood sewers and wood water pipes, and they were just a few feet apart in the ground. Okay? And so, you had to be really careful about those things. So what's happened here in Flint is a real serious problem. And it was compounded because government officials did not listen to the people who knew there was a problem when there was a problem. So you have a bureaucratic problem, you have a regulatory problem, but you also have the system problem of having to have this city manager that's now thinking and managing the place as a government rather than managing it as a business more as than a government. And then you also have this have the problem of what got us into that in the first place. So there's all of those issues that are part of that. And I was part of a water ceremony on the banks of the river in Flint. A number of us went down there and did ceremony on the banks and prayed for the water and for the people there. And we sent bottled water down, okay, because that's the only way they could survive. And we spent time lobbying and raising questions with our elected officials over this issue. We did a lot of different things that we could do. Flint, unfortunately, is not the only place that things like this have happened, but it's the one where everybody knows about it. But many other cities have a similar kind of problem, if not system-wide in neighborhoods. They have similar systems, similar issues. And I've been reading about the testing of municipal water supplies that's much more intense now because of Flint. And there's a lot of other places being discovered where there's issues. So Flint was an extremely bad thing that happened. And there's a lot of facets to it.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I guess to kind of round this up, what would you like to see people do? What's your message to everyone who's watching right now? What would you like to share with them as something that they can do or something they can think about? Well,
when it comes to when it comes to protecting our water, everybody can do something in their life. For years I've been saying that one of the things you can do is when you're brushing your teeth, turn the tap water off while you're brushing. And you do that whether you've got a well of your own or whether you're on a municipal water supply or whatever. And if you do that all year long, that's a lot of water that didn't go down the drain. That either wasn't pumped, wasn't purified, didn't have to go through a septic system or through a water treatment plant. That's a big deal. Drive less. Find ways to do more things like being online like we are right now. Find ways to communicate with each other and to hold meetings. I've been holding a lot of telephone meetings and Skype meetings. I sit on a lot of boards. We do a lot of things in this way now where we're using technology to try to cut down on our travel. And I'm one of those people. I can talk a lot about cutting down on travel, but I travel an awful lot. I have a pretty high carbon footprint because I fly a lot to meetings all over. And it's one of those issues that the meetings are important. We've got to do these things, and yet we try to figure out ways to be less harmful. You know, a basic philosophy is do no harm. If we've already done it, if we're already doing it, stop it. And if we've done it, try to find a way to clean it up.
Absolutely. Well, I'd really thank you for spending so much time with us and for sharing so much wisdom on such a breadth of topics and giving us so much to think about. So I truly appreciate your time today, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you.